Hello class, welcome to the final segment in week 2, and in this final segment we're going to take a look at sort of an expansion of what we talked about in the previous segment. So in the previous segment we talked about something called an if-else block, and in this segment we're going to talk about something that's usually referred to as an if-elif-else block. So that's what we're going to be looking at, and just like in the previous segments, we have just a super simple variable declaration up here. We have the variable x being set equal to a number that we can easily reference as we analyze the program. And down here on line 3, we have the same old if statements that we've been looking at prior in the previous segments. And here we're going to be asking if the variable x is greater than or equal to 30, which we can see that x is not greater than or equal to 30. 25 is not greater than or equal to 30. So right off the bat, we expect that this condition on line 3 and this if statement will fail, which means the indentation here is going to be completely ignored. But down here on line 5, we have an elif statement. And this actually is, I believe this was supposed to be a blend of the words else and if, because in other programming languages like C and Java, this statement is more generally referred to as an else if statement. But I guess the creators of Python decided to just take those two words and mash them into one word, as if you can even call that a word. So else if, that's why I read this off as elif, because I'm reading this off as a combination of the words else and if all turned into one word, which I guess if you mash those two words together, you get the word elif, assuming that's even a word in the first place. But that point aside, the way that the computer is going to interpret this is it's only going to ask this condition. It's only going to test this condition if and only if the condition above it fails. So the computer is not going to interpret this bit on line 5 here unless this if statement fails, unless the condition inside this if statement were to fail. And since x is equal to 25, then this if statement does in fact have its condition fail, which means this elif statement on line 5 is eligible to be run. So in light of that, since this condition up here fails, the computer is then allowed to test if the variable x is greater than or equal to 20. Since we can see x is 25, 25 is greater than or equal to 20, which means just like any other indented block as part of if, else, whatever it might be, the indentation that appears directly below that is something that the computer will actually run. So since 25 is in fact greater than or equal to 20, this condition is met, meaning what's on line 6 here, which is just a simple print statement, is something that the computer is going to act on. And then down here on line 7, we have another elif statement. Again, we require that the condition above it fail in order for the computer to even consider this. But since this condition up here did not fail, since 25 is in fact greater or equal to 20, the computer is not even going to interpret what's on line 7 here. It's just going to completely ignore that because one of the requirements for the elif statement is for the statement above it, the condition above it, to fail. Since this condition did not fail, that means that this elif statement is something that no longer is subject to run. And also, that means this statement on line 9 is also no longer subject to run because the condition above it was satisfied. So you can see this sort of has a downstream effect here. If one of these conditions is met, that means every elif that appears after that is not even going to be acted on. The computer is just going to completely ignore it. And also, since one of these conditions are also down here at the bottom, I have the else, kind of like what we had in the previous segment. And just like in the previous segment, the else is only going to run if every condition above it fails. So we can actually jump back to the previous segment and we can see how here we only have one condition that appears above the else, which is just this one. So if every condition above the else fails, then and only then will the computer actually act on the else and print whatever is indented below the else. So the same general rule holds here. This else statement on line 11 is only going to run if and only if every single condition that appears above it fails. But after going through all that, just to sort of summarize the outcome, this condition fails. This condition does not fail. 25 is in fact greater than or equal to 20. And since we have a condition that is met, that means every elif and else that appears below that is not even going to be, it's just going to be completely ignored. The computer is just going to completely ignore whatever appears below the elif statements once it gets a condition that is in fact met. So the only thing that we should see when the computer actually runs through this, we should only see this print statement on line 6 get interpreted, which means we should only see statement number 2 appear in the console if we were going to run this right now. So let's go ahead and verify that result. You can see we do in fact get statement number 2. So let's go ahead and walk through the logic of this again, but this time let's go ahead and use a different value of x. And one thing that I should also go ahead and mention is just like the if statement, the elif has a colon at the end of it, and the statement that appears below the elif must also be indented to some degree. But let's go ahead and walk through the logic of this again. This time, let's go ahead and use a value of -5 for x. So again, let's go through the conditions one by one. Here we're asking if the variable x is greater than or equal to 30, which is not the case. -5 is not greater than or equal to 30, so right off the bat, this condition fails. So that means we can now test if x is greater than or equal to 20 as part of the requirements for an elif statement. So -5 is not greater than or equal to 20 either, so this condition also fails. Which means we can now go down here on line 7 and ask if x is greater than or equal to 10, which again is not, so that condition also fails. Which means we can now go down to line 9 and ask if -5 is greater than or equal to 0, which again it is not. That condition also fails, which means now we go down to the else statement, and since every condition above this else statement failed, then the computer will run whatever is part of the else statement, in this case printing out statement number 5, which if we run the program to sort of verify that result, we do in fact get statement number 5. One thing that also should be noted is these elif statements are entirely optional, but also the else is entirely optional. So I could, if I wanted to, just delete this else statement, which just gives me a situation where all of these conditions fail, which means the computer isn't going to run any of these print statements, which means that I will just get absolutely nothing appear in the console. So again, a point that I made in the previous segment that's worth reiterating is by including this else statement here, you're guaranteeing that the computer will do something, whatever that something might is, regardless of what happens in the conditions that appear above it. So let's also sort of do this again, but here I'm going to again ask you to pause the video and try to sort through the logic of this on your own. So here I'm going to set x equal to 5, and I'll go ahead and ask you to pause the video and come up with an answer as to what the computer is, or what the program is going to produce as a final result if I were to go to run the program right now. So I'll give you a few seconds to do that. So hopefully the answer that you got will sort of look like what we're about to see on the screen here. So here we're again asking if the variable x is greater than or equal to 30. That condition fails, so that means we can go down to what's on line 5 here. Again, we're asking if the variable x is greater than or equal to 20, which it's not. That condition also fails, so that means we go down to what's on line 7, the next elif statement. 5 is not greater than or equal to 10 either. That condition fails. So now we go down to what's on line 9, asking if the variable x is greater than or equal to 0, which finally we have a condition that doesn't fail, so that means that we print out statement number 4. We act on the indentation that appears directly below the elif. And since we did have a condition that was met, then the else statement is completely ignored. Remember, the else statement requires everything above it to fail in order for the else to even be relevant. So the end result of this should just be the computer printing out statement number 4, and by running the program, we can in fact verify that result. And something else that might be worth exploring, another avenue that we should probably talk about, is to contrast what we have on the screen right now with something like this. So again, one of the requirements for an elif statement in order for the condition in the elif to be interpreted or to even be relevant is the condition above it must fail, or a condition above it must fail, which is one of the requirements for an elif statement. But if I don't use the elif here, that means we no longer have that requirement in place. We no longer require a condition above the elif to fail in order for the elif to be even, or in order for the condition to even be relevant. So by taking away the elif here, I no longer have that requirement for the condition above it to fail. And let me actually go ahead and put this value of x back to 25. So here's how the computer is going to read this differently than before. So again, this condition fails. 25 is not greater than or equal to 30, so we ignore that. Now we have a condition asking if x is greater than or equal to 20, which that is the case. 25 is greater than or equal to 20, so that means the computer is going to print out statement number 2, which appears on line 6 here. And since we no longer have the elif here, that means we are still able to test if these other conditions are met. So now we're able to ask if x is greater than or equal to 10, which is also the case. That is also true. which means the computer is also going to print out statement number 3. And then same thing down here, if x is greater than or equal to 10, or excuse me, if x is greater than or equal to 0, that condition is also met since 25 is greater than or equal to 0. And that means this print statement on line 10 is also something that the computer is going to act on. So in this particular case, without using the else statement, we are now allowing multiple conditions to actually be interpreted. We're allowing the computer to actually act on multiple different conditions if those conditions are in fact true. And in this case, we're allowing the computer to act on this condition, this condition as well, and also this condition. So by removing the elif, we allow the computer to test multiple conditions, and you can see we do in fact get multiple conditions being satisfied, and we get the end result of that, which is these 3 print statements. Again, in contrast that we had before, where we have the elif statements in place. And again, part of the elif statements is we require a condition above it to fail. And the moment a condition doesn't fail, that means all of the elifs that appear afterwards that are considered to be part of that block are no longer in play. The computer will just completely ignore them. So again, just to sort of contrast the idea of having all the if statements, which is what we just had, as opposed to having what we started with, which involves all the elifs here. So using these if-elif-else blocks is a great tool to sort of ensure that you only get one thing, you only get the computer to act on one thing and one thing only, as opposed to using multiple if statements where, depending on the conditions, there is some potential for the computer to run multiple if statements, run the result of multiple if statements being true. But by using an if-elif-else block like the one that we have on the screen here, this basically ensures that the computer will run one and only one of these in the end. And in this particular case, which is the one we started with, the computer is only going to act on this condition, and it's going to ignore everything that appears below it. So that's a look at the if-elif-else block and the whole idea behind an elif statement. So the structure is very similar. Syntax-wise, it's pretty much the same identical structure as the if statement, except here we add an extra el in front of it. Also, make sure that the elif statement comes after an if. So again, you can't reverse the order here without the computer giving you a syntax error. So make sure the order goes if first, then elifs, however many you want, and then at the very end of that, if you want to include an else, the else has to come at the very end. So just to sort of illustrate that, you would not be able to put the else in here and expect the computer to actually make sense of that. So if you're going to include an else in here, make sure the else comes at the very end, and that's the very last thing that the computer sees in a block like this. But that's going to do it for this final segment on if statements, and with that, that's going to do it for the week 2 material. So with that, I will see you all in the next weekly unit when we start talking about loops. So I will see you all there.